And tonight's tale, Memories, the Covenant, Part 5. The lighthouse was gone. The Stalward, that beacon of hope and light upon the rocky cliffside, meant to warn sailors away from what would surely be a frigid grave amongst the tumultuous waves, had simply ceased to exist. Along with my family that had been within. Numbly, mechanically, I made my way back to the truck, where I stood idling in the middle of the road and climbed in, the door closing behind me with a hollow sound that rang out into the gathering darkness, and fumbled with shaking hands for my cell phone, which I had left in the centre console. My hands were shaking so badly that I managed to drop the device down near my feet, and with a curse, stooped to pick it up from between the pedals. And on pure instinct, I dialed my wife's number and placed the phone to my ear, my eyes blinded by the tears that had formed there, pooling over the iris with grief of everything that I had lost, somehow, and would never have again. In an instant, the weariness and despair that had wrapped itself yet so firmly around my soul dissipated as the sound of Ashley's voice came through the phone, reaching into my ear. "Everything all right, Eli? You've been gone all day, and dinner is nearly ready," she said, the dulcet tones of her voice sounding all the more musical than they had ever done so in the past, as if they were carried to my consciousness not by the electronic mysteries that comprised the rectangular piece of technology that I had held to the side of my face, but by the wings of angels to hearken to the shattered being that I would surely become in her absence. My eyes, having been pressed together tightly against the torrent of stinging tears, flew open at once at the sound of her voice, and immediately beheld the scene before me of the Stalward, returned to its vigil on the molehill-covered grounds at the edge of the sea, complete with unlocked gate and dual mailboxes outside, with several large packages propped up against the latter. At once, I put the truck in gear and drove up to the gate, calling into the phone like a madman that I would be home in just a moment and would explain when I arrived, and hanging up before I heard the reply, refusing to take my eyes off the lighthouse, even to blink, for fear it would be gone. I got out of the truck to open the gate and manoeuvred the packages that stood near the mailbox into the back of the truck with everything else, then sped my way up the drive and practically threw myself through the door, my eyes stinging in protest, for I had refused to blink until I made it inside. I was greeted by the warm and earthy smells of a roast cooking and potatoes and garlic as I made my way swiftly up the small entryway and out into the kitchen, where my wife Ashley was busying herself with plating the glorious meal that she had made for the family. Disregarding anything and everything, I rushed up to her and spun her to face me, before picking her up into my arms, her feet rising off the floor, and held her close to my heaving chest, my nose buried at once into her hair, to just breathe in the scent of her. She giggled in surprise and threw her arms around my neck as I nuzzled into her, just feeling her form, warm and solid and soft against me, as my own chest finally began to still back into a normal rhythm. At last, I leaned forward to return her feet to the ground, not yet daring to let go of her completely. "Well, hello there," she said, as she took a small step backwards, regaining her balance, and then looked up at me with that smile of hers. That special smile she saved just for me, that melted my heart and allayed all the fears and worry of just moments before. In response, I gave a smirk and an exhale through my nose before kissing her on the cheek and willing myself to let her go. "Sorry I spent so long in town, Ash. The townsfolk really do hold you hostage," I said, then explained that I'd tell her all about it over dinner. The sound of her tinkling laughter rung in my ears like a wind chime in a warm summer breeze. "All right then, it better be a good story," she replied, without any hint of annoyance to her words. "Go turn on the light and send the kids to wash up while you go." I pecked her on the cheek once more and made my way up the stairs, calling out to the kids to wash up for dinner as I continued the trek upstairs past their rooms, damning every star as I went, exhausted by the day, the breakneck flight back to the Stalward, the crippling loss of everything that I held dear, and its sudden reappearance. With each step forward towards the lantern room, my thighs gave little jolts of electric protest as the muscles contracted, and I thought once again about looking into getting one of those star lifts installed. Devlin could take my man card for all I cared. These stars were killer. At last, I summited to the light box and made my way round the bench, turning knobs and dials before throwing the switch to bring the twin beams of luminescence to life, along with the gentle thrumming sound of the machinery. By this time, I did not pause to watch as the rays of brilliance swept their way across the land and sea before heading back down the stairs, my stomach growling as I followed the delicious smells of my wife's home-cooked meal back to the kitchen. Ashley had brought plates to the table already when I arrived to take my seat with the kids, and we waited patiently while she bowed her head in silent revelry to whatever gods or deities she would give her thanks to, as always. My eyes swept over the glorious bounty of pork rice and potatoes, bright green steamed broccoli, and a basket filled to the brim with golden buttery croissants. Ashley had been enthralled with the tale of my adventure into town, about the quaint shopkeeper at the hardware store, and about the trip to pick up new trappings for the bedroom, which she could not wait to see. While she was doing the dishes, I made my way out to the truck and began hauling in the boxes for her, as well as the deliveries that had been sitting outside near the mailboxes. I could only assume that the art supplies I had ordered for her studio, had arrived earlier than expected, and began to haul them upstairs so that she could open those as well. I had apparently done quite well with the selection of the bedding, and my darling wife was pleased enough that she agreed to take the card from Martha and give a ring. Turns out, she was quite interested in the Ladies' Rotary Club after all, and that it would be a nice change of pace for her, bringing her back in line with how things used to be in her youth. I regretted that I had never really taken the time to inquire more previously, as she set about gushing over the selections that Martha had helped me to make and purchase for her. And we made our way to the bedroom, where she began stripping down the bed to the mattress to fit the new linens in place. Once completed, we yet had another surprise for her, and led her down to the floor that would be her studio. The twin beams of the lighthouse sweeping through to illuminate the space from the window in their never-ending dance of light and darkness, sleep and wakefulness, round and round in a never-ending circle, to a thrumming rhythm that could be felt in but the faintest whisper through my feet as they stood firmly against the floor as my wife made her way to the first of the packages. It was tall and thin, and I knew at once that it could only be the easels that I had ordered for her. She struggled with the box, having been bound tightly at its seams with heavy packing tape. Automatically, I reached into my back pocket for the trusty knife that I kept clipped to my jeans, and flicked it open with a practiced motion that I did not reflect upon being strange until after I started forwards with it to cut the box for her. I was not, in fact, accustomed to carrying a knife in my pocket at all times, nor had I ever particularly been fond of carrying one even at work when it was a necessary tool to have, and preferred to keep one instead in my toolbox. The necessity of going to grab it having always provided a small and welcome relief from actual work whenever it was needed. A quick walk from my workstation across the shop floor to my toolbox and back was usually all the breather I needed when being absorbed in rather intensive work orders, and none could really argue with the need to fetch a tool. I shook it off, trying to reason that perhaps we had absently grabbed it on my way into town, assuming that I might need it for the yard supplies or packaging. Perhaps I had picked it up knowing Ashley would need it to open her yard supplies. Whatever the events that led to it, we did have the knife and what she needed, and I carefully slipped the tip in through and dragged the blade down along the seam at the top, shearing through the thick packing tape like it were merely the seawater outside the window. When finished, I closed the knife in my palm and slipped it back into my back pocket, taking note for the first time of the weight of it, confused as to how I had not noticed it there previously. And then Ashley gasped in delight as she reached into the now open box and withdrew the wooden folding easel, pulling carefully at its legs so the hinges spread and snapped into place. She flipped a couple of metal clips that secured it and stood back, beaming, before turning to me, her face awash with her delight, cheeks rosy and eyes sparkling. She took a few quick steps towards me and then bounced up into the air, throwing her arms around my neck and straining to peck my cheek as she giggled out her thanks. A warmth spread through my chest, that masculine pride when a man does right by his woman, and wrapped my arms around her back, holding her aloft for a moment and enjoying the brilliance of her happiness, before setting her back down and urging her towards the other boxes as well. She was so beautiful, I reflected, as I watched the light of the Stalward dance across her features and through her eyes as she unboxed the various sets of brushes and paints from the boxes, humouring me, I'm sure, with assurances that they were perfect, and that I had not mistakenly gotten her something that she would never use. There was a certain childishness to the way that Ashley would light up when she was happy like this, as if all the weight of her years had been washed away, and she was the jovial and buoyant beauty that she had been when I first met her that summer afternoon along the seaside. Not that she had aged now far beyond that, but her eyes did betray, from time to time, the tolls that life tends to take. It is a weary world. It wasn't long before she had finished bouncing around on feet as light as her heart, placing paints and brushes and canvases just so, in places across the room that she had no doubt already envisioned 100 times before this moment. I had watched her with delight, not moving lest I break her revelry, simply tracking every movement of her dress as it fluttered, every sound of her bare feet against the wooden floor, every movement of her hair as it swung back and forth about her neck with an almost predatory alertness. When she had last returned to my side, I smirked down with her, with a little lifting of brow and a soft, playful growl at her happiness. She flushed at once, her eyes going wide for a moment, before twinkling softly, and she bit her lower lip as she looked down, her cheeks pulling up despite the smile she tried to hide, in that special smile that she always saved just for me. One of her legs jittered a little, her foot kicking lightly at the floor, like an embarrassed schoolgirl for a moment, before she looked up at me, winked, and took off running up the stairs towards the bedroom, with a giggle on her lips, leaving me to stalk after her. Several hours later, I awoke, curled up in bed beside Ashley's sleeping form, nestled tight against my chest, to the sound of that damned alarm again. I rose out of bed and found my pants where they had been discarded on the floor beside the bed in our flurry to get upstairs earlier, and crept out of the bedroom and swung my way up the stairs to the lantern room, hoping to disengage the alarm before it woke Ashley or the kids. As I stepped up into the landing, just as I had done previously, the alarm once again faded into silence, and I caught sight of the twin beams making their unending circles over the water. This damned alarm. I fished around in the pockets of my jeans for my phone, which fortunately still had some battery left, having not bothered to plug it in before falling asleep. And I shot a text to Devlin, asking if he could drop by in the morning and take a look at this damned thing before I called the repair guy. That done, and satisfied that I would, hopefully, stop being woken up by the faulty alarm out of a dead sleep, I turned my way back downstairs, planning to climb back into bed with Ashley for a few more hours rest, when a static crackling sounded in my ears, coming from the radio. That made me jump. I rushed over to the radio and immediately reached for the knob, as the broadcast was garbled and broken, breaking through over the standard frequency from something beyond its range.
No, he's medical. 37.2. Over.
The voice on the radio sounded frantic as I spun the dial, trying desperately to locate a frequency that would be clear enough to understand whomever was speaking. Whoever it was, and from whatever passing ship, the radio operator had a certain sound of desperation to his voice that was beyond unnerving. Just as quickly as the broadcast had begun, it was gone again, and I was surrounded again by silence, broken only by the steady hum and whirl of the machinery behind me. That voice sounded somehow familiar, not simply because I had pegged it nearly instantly as the same voice I had heard before, but in some other way, as if some intangible quality of the voice stirring something deep in the back of my mind, some memory perhaps of a distant time, like a recollection of a late night programme watched years ago in the half-waking state in the early hours of the morning when you left the television on. A dull, throbbing pain began to spread across my forehead, emanating from the place where I had the stitches from that stupid chair. How could I have been so careless? Frustrated, I turned from the lantern room and made my way back down the stairs. My palm clutched gingerly over my forehead, where the pain was throbbing with my pulse, and made my way back into the bedroom, mentally kicking myself for being so clumsy, angry at the faulty alarm, and unsettled by the radio, though I tried to tell myself that it was likely, as it had been before, simply a broadcast picked up from a military channel that I was not meant to hear regardless. As I walked around the bed slowly, Ashley sat up, apparently having been awakened either by the alarm or my absence. I couldn't tell which. "Everything all right, love?" she said, her voice thick with sleep. "Yeah, just my damn head," I said as I climbed back into bed. She gave me a quizzical look for a moment, before asking if I wanted to take something for it, and when I refused, assuring her that I would be fine. She rolled over onto my chest and was asleep in a matter of moments. I lay awake for a time, watching the hypnotic lights continue their mystical dance past the window, until I too finally succumbed back to sleep. At a much more reasonable hour to be awake, with the sun having already risen well enough to hearken daybreak into the world, even be it a dull, greyish sort of day, I swung my way up the stairs to the lantern room to bring a halt to the mechanised beacon before taking a shower and descending to the kitchen after a cup of coffee. Ashley and the kids had already eaten breakfast, it seemed. She was to be found washing up the dishes. She smiled when she saw me and offered to whip me up some eggs now that I was awake. She had let me sleep in, she said, since I had been up so late. So thoughtful she was. I assured her that I was fine with just some coffee, which I set about making, and told her that I had contacted Devlin about seeing to the alarm and that he should be round today. She gave me a tight smile and then a peck on the cheek, laughing to herself for a moment as she went back to her task. She never could stand the sight of dishes being in the sink, whether it be from a full course meal or a single mug. My little homemaker she was. I smiled as I placed my mug down in the sink next to her, once I had drained it of its contents, and then made my way outside to the truck, intent on getting cracking at the yard work. The air was brisk as I opened the door, and the little hairs on the back of my arms raised as the smell of salt and sea greeted my nostrils. Were I not planning on doing manual labour, I would have made my way back inside after a jacket, but I knew, soon enough, we'd be sweating and discard the garment, so I didn't bother as I rounded the back of the truck and began hauling down bags of seed and topsoil, along with the shovels and stamper I had bought. It was going to be the work of several days, most likely, filling in and stamping down the holes that littered the grounds. Best get to it. We set up the equipment, leaning against the stone wall closest to the sea, and started out on the first of what I had previously thought were a series of little bumps and hills created by a combination of rain and wind. Looking at it now, I realised there must be a larger problem, for the uneven earth was less happenstance and more directed. Molehills, we reasoned, having been dug and turned ages ago and then left. Excellent. It wasn't enough that I'd have to fill in the holes and tamp them down, but I was going to have to deal with a rodent infestation as well. I could only hope that it was a single mole, rather than a family, or worse yet, a colony of the filthy little creatures. I set about anyways, muttering quietly to myself about all the work that was to be coming my way as I went. Using the shovel, I did my best to scoop the disturbed earth back into 5 or 6 of the nearest holes where I set up, and then returned with the heavy bags of soil to fill them in and make up the difference for whatever had been lost, either washed away by rain or blown away by wind when it was loose, as well as to fill in the gaps between the ruddy clumps that had been exposed to the air for too long. After this, I grabbed the stamper, a flat expanse of a metal head attached to a pole like a shovel, and began the process of tamping everything down, including the grass around the holes, to a nice, flat, even expanse. It was exhausting work, and soon enough, sweat was pricking at my brow and forming on my forearms. When I completed the first few holes and stood back to admire my work, all I could really focus on, unfortunately, was what an incredibly small area they covered, and how much more there was to go before I could consider the task completed. It was going to take days, at the very least, weeks in all likelihood. And that was assuming that something didn't come by again to dig up the yard as I was working, undoing all of my hard work. With a sigh, I ran my hand through my hair to push the sweat off my brow and the hair out of my eyes, just in time to catch a glimpse of the smiling face that was just walking up to the gate at the end of the driveway. Relieved to have a respite from the work, and realising that it had already slipped into midday, I set aside my tools and wiped my hands on my chains, before making my way down the driveway to let him in, really starting to feel the throbbing in my head again, where I had managed to split it open before. Perhaps all the movement and strain of the hard work was causing it to flare up. But of course, I wasn't about to seem like a wimp in front of the specimen that was Devlin, as he stood there by the gate, in a plaid flannel shirt and jeans, looking like the bounty man with a blue tick hound sitting at his heels. The dog seemed to get rather defensive as we approached and opened the gate for him to come inside, its tail dropping low while its ears laid back over the back of its head. And while it didn't growl at me, I could tell it was more to speak for the training of the animal than anything else. This must be the hunting dog that Devlin had mentioned previously, and it seemed like quite the mean old thing. Her yellowish eyes were keen despite her apparent age, tracking my every motion without the faintest bit of levity, her head angled downward as though she might leap at any moment in my direction, as she no doubt had done countless times before on a hunt. Nonetheless, Devlin was his normal, jovial self, and greeted me as we made our way up the driveway.
Dixie!
Briar called as he came bounding out of the house, Max not far behind. To my horror, they both went running up towards the hellish hound, with all the excitement children tended to have for animals. I cringed at the thought of the hound snapping at either of them, let alone sinking teeth into waiting flesh. The dog hardly seemed to be the most social of creatures, to say the least, and I did not put it past Briar to throw his arms around the animal in a very human gesture of a hug that few dogs would enjoy, let alone one that seemed as mean and ill-tempered as this one. To my shock and relief, however, the dog did not snap or snarl, nor did it attack the kids, but rather her tail shot up and set to wagging while her ears perked, and she jumped up on her front paws onto Briar's chest, licking at his face and sniffling at his ears, her body jittery with movement and excitement. Briar patted her sides and rubbed behind her ears, and eventually told the dog to get down. She did so, still excitedly pressing herself up against his legs, her left flank and then her right, encouraging him to keep patting her. And when he stooped down to do so, she threw herself onto the ground and flopped over to expose her stomach for rubs, her tongue flopping out of her mouth between a pair of rather slobbery jowls. Briar obliged, and I rolled my eyes. Max had been on his heels on the way out the door, but rather than being interested in the hound, she began asking Devlin at once about the festival in town. The kids had been learning all about the town in history class on the computer, apparently, and Max was near to bursting with questions about the superstitions and legends that surrounded the town. Devlin was good-natured about the whole thing, launching into a story at once as we made our way inside. Long ago, Ito said, that the town was overcome by a disastrous storm that wrecked all of the boats in the harbour, leaving the townspeople without means by which to bring food home to their families. The land at the time, of course, being so near the sea, meant that the rain was too salty to grow crops, so the townspeople were sure to starve. But, fortunately, a seafaring vessel, the SS Morrowind, happened by and rescued the townspeople by providing enough fish to get through the winter months, while the people put all their energies towards building new boats. According to the legend, however, the Morrowind had angered an ancient god and sent the storm to wipe out the town, and it was dashed against the rocks, all its sailors lost to the sea. It was because of that fateful night that the townspeople came together to build the Stalward, that they might warn others away from meeting the same fate. That was why, every year, they held a festival in town to commemorate the brave men that had saved the town and so tragically lost their own lives in doing. Max was inquisitive as always, asking 1,001 questions, and then wringing a promise from Devlin that they would indeed go to the festival this year and check it out, with further promises of hot chocolate and firelight stories that took place each year in the town square. I admit, I had hoped that Devlin would have stayed at the lighthouse, since it could not be kept empty, so that I might enjoy the festival with my family. But that was a lot to ask a man who had already done so much for us. Truly, I was lucky to have such a chap around the house while we made the transition to a new life. The climb up the stairs was arduous, as my head started throbbing horribly again, and though I tried to be manly and avoid doing so, I couldn't help but clutch my hand to the wound at my temple, getting dizzier with every step I made towards the lantern room. I was woozy, and time seemed to slow down, as if each star was an insurmountable mountain. My pulse whirled in my ears, and I swayed as my vision went dark. But still, onwards and upwards I dragged myself, knowing Devlin was right behind me, and determined that I would make it to the summit before passing out altogether. Amid the throbbing of my own heartbeat in my forehead, the laboured sounds of my own ragged breathing, there was another sound that pierced my consciousness, as I forced my weak and weary limbs up another step, and another, the sound of a distant crackling voice on a radio, making its way through the haze of pain and anguish that was swirling through my soul and cracking like lightning through every white-hot nerve engulfed with pain.
Man down on the starboard side. Send medical immediately.
That voice, the voice from the radio that I had heard previously, and somehow had known all along, was swirling in my mind as I struggled, my hand leaving my head and planting down on the stairs, as I attempted to crawl my way, half blinded up the stairs, feeling as though my head was going to split in two, each beat of my pulse threatening to crack my skull further and further apart.
Eli was welding in section 37.25. He's conscious, but no improvement. Hurry up, damn it. Over.
Blood was flowing freely from the wound in my head, dripping down in a hot, sticky torrent of salt and sweat into my already blinded eyes. The few glimpses of the world that I was able to take around me tinged with red as I struggled and tried to crawl my way back up from below, but all in vain. The end was coming, swirling up from beneath me in a steady wave of blackness that began to wrap itself up from my feet, making its way ever closer to my eyes. And then there I was, clutching fabric to my head and swaying horribly, sickeningly, as the ambulance veered its way through traffic, the deafening sounds of sirens piercing my eardrums and causing me to stir. And then there, in the empty ward with the deathly stillness, empty of every soul save for her, my darling, beautiful wife, a decade's worth of aging, at once removed from her face, and then instantly replaced by her horror-stricken grief, and trying to reach out to her, to hold her, to comfort her. But it was like trying to capture smoke with my bare hands. And there, watching as the kids were pulled out of school to keep them from failing, due to their misery, and Ashley taking 2 jobs to keep everything afloat, watching her cry herself to sleep, night after night, just out of reach, unable to bring her comfort as the light and joy and happiness dimmed from her world. He watched, paralysed, a conscious yet unseen form as the replay of the life that she had lived without me flashed before my blinded eyes like a bolt of lightning through my being. Whatever that very being was. I saw her there, on the seaside pier where we had met, weeping in the sunlight with her broken heart, and there was Devlin walking by. They met, they spoke, they went for coffee. He met the children, took her to the movies, dinners, weekend camping trips in the country, him holding her as she cried and vowing to never try to replace what she had lost, but to bring back light to her life. And he was down on one knee, a small box in his hand and a glittering ring as she said yes through the tears. He was helping her back and driving across the country with the kids, hiring movers to help bring their things into the place, packing their own furniture into the shed so that Ashley could feel at home, bringing home a puppy to the delight of the children and watching it dig up the yard. At that moment, the pain stopped, and I floated up from where I had been crawling on the ground, up and out of Devlin's body, to watch him tremble and shake before standing up on unsteady feet and look about, confused. He wouldn't remember why he was crawling his way up the stairs, no more than he would remember all the recent bouts where he was too proud to admit that he had been losing time. I watched from afar as he righted himself, shook his head to clear it, and continued on up the stairs towards the lantern room. With a practised deftness, he reached under a girder that surrounded the pole which held the light, one hand reaching easily into his back pocket for a knife that was always there, and flipping it open to use its tip to unscrew the little cover on the alarm box and replace its battery. Once he had finished, he made his way back downstairs, with myself floating, stunned, incorporeal after him, as I reached the kitchen and wrapped his arms around Ashley, giving her a kiss on the cheek as I had longed to do so, and still do long to do, before telling her that he thought he should lie down for a while. He must have been starting to come down with something, and told her about how he had gotten dizzy, not for the first time, on the stairs lately. Perhaps age was starting to get to him, I said. Ashley fussed over him before sending him off to bed, and I watched, helplessly, forlorn, as the kids made their way inside with their hound, Dixie, off to play upstairs, no doubt, and Ashley set about the kitchen to whip up some baked majesty for her family and her new husband. As I drifted, I could feel the tightness in my chest and eyes with tears that could not fall. Further and further away from the Stalward and its single, sweeping beam of light as it rotated over the grounds and out to the sea for miles. Thank you, Mrs. Geraldine, for allowing me this opportunity to see my family and to look after my wife and children one last time. I am sorry that I broke our bargain by disobeying the rules that we had agreed to. I hope that my conduct will not prevent you from helping other lost spirits like me in the future. If you could find it in your heart as a medium, as a kind and benevolent soul, perhaps you might let Ashley know that I love her, and that she was the light of my life. And I'm sorry that Devlin was so unlucky.